Hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and do the lecture for chapter 15 and a little bit of 16 today. You're not going to need to know much from 16, just mostly from chapter 15, a couple slides from 16. Not that 16 is not important, but a lot of the stuff in the chapter, as you go and do your personal reading, you're going to see that you probably already know most of the information because we've gone over it throughout the semester. So let's start with 15. This is all about nutrition throughout childhood and adolescent years. Last week we talked about pregnancy and a little bit of infancy in terms of breastfeeding, but we're going to now go beyond that. And you're going to see how important these years are for building the foundation for the rest of your life. No pressure for mom and dad when you have a baby. Actually, it is a lot of pressure because you're thinking about not only yourself now, you're thinking about somebody else's life and making sure that you're feeding them almost in your mind. You almost think you want to feed them perfectly to build that healthy foundation for the rest of their life. Okay, so if you start looking at the statistics here, you'll see that weight nearly triples by the end of the first year. That's a lot. It has been said that after the baby is born, it should really be labeled as the fourth trimester, which I think is so funny because, obviously in pregnancy, there's 3 trimesters. They say that because the growth rate is so rapid during that first year of life. And it's so incredibly important that parents or caretakers are keeping on top of their game, so to speak, for their growing infant. So if you look at the length, increases 50% by the end of the first year. Obviously, you need to have proper nutrition, all the nutrients that we've already talked about in here. It's so incredibly important. You're continuing with breastfeeding if you can do that. If you can't do breastfeeding, the other option would be to do formula feeding, which basically mimics breast milk in terms of the nutrients. When you're looking at growth charts here, you'll see that these are done every time you go into the pediatrician's office. And what they do is they look at your weight and your length. So there's one for girls and one for boys. And they plot it on a chart. And they basically are showing the growth rate. They want to make sure it has this curvature to it. If it is looking more flat or it's not going up at all, that's a problem. That means they label it as failure to thrive, which means that the baby's growth rate is not at a proper percentile. And so there's something that's not quite right. So that's why it's so incredibly important to make sure that you're going and you're staying on top of all of those. There's a lot of visits during the first couple years of life. You feel like you're in the pediatrician's office all the time, but it's really important to keep continuing to do that because what they're doing is they are ensuring that the baby is growing at a proper rate. And they're looking at your height, your weight. They don't actually call it height, it's length because you're so tiny. They're also looking at your head circumference. It's not on this chart, but they will make sure that your head circumference is actually growing at a certain rate as well, because that's incredibly important to look at. When the brain is not growing at a certain rate, the head will actually be a little smaller, and that's a huge cause for concern, obviously, because your brain controls everything in your body, and your brain grows at a very rapid pace during ages 0 to 2. And nutrition has so much to do with that. So the way they do weight classifications for children are different than they do for adults. Obviously, you guys are well aware of the BMI chart that we have for adults. They actually do percentiles for kids. And percentiles are, again, it's something to just keep in mind. It's not a perfect system, just like with the BMI chart, like we've talked about. However, it's a good classification system for looking at mass groups of children in the United States. So it doesn't necessarily mean if your child is in the 95th percentile for height and weight, for this in this category, it's weight. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are overweight, but it does mean for the majority of kids, that's what that is going to come down to. I can speak personally for this. Both of my kids, I had huge babies when they were born. My first son was 9 pounds, 6 ounces, which is considered quite large. And my second one was 8 pounds, 10 ounces, but he was a little bit early. And so we always joke that, oh, he was the shrimp, compared to his big brother. And both of them have always, even to this day, have always been actually not in the 95th. They're actually both in the 98th percentile for their weight. But both of them, if you were to see them in person, are very tall. They're much taller than their peers in their class. And so because of that, it kind of throws off the whole system here. So it's funny because I remember at one appointment, this has only happened one time to me. In one appointment, the doctor did the height and the weight, and it was a new doctor. We hadn't seen her before, and it went to the 98th percentile. And I remember she said, "Oh, you better be careful about do you know how to feed your child?" And I remember laughing because I said, "Oh, I actually teach nutrition, at a college." And she was like, "Oh, okay." So we had this funny conversation, but it ended up being fine in the end. And I was explaining, yes, he's getting his fruits and his vegetables and all this stuff. And then we looked at his height. And she went, "Oh, now I understand." So it was an interesting conversation, and I remember totally thinking about this particular chart while we were having that conversation. And I haven't had that conversation since with another pediatrician. That was just kind of a total mishap. The first food that babies get, and when I say food, I mean this first solid food that babies get during the first year of life, around the age of 6 months, is rice cereal. And that is strictly because it is the one food that most everybody is not allergic to. So it's super easy on the tummy. The digestive system digests it well. What you're supposed to do, if you've ever seen it, it looks like this powdery substance, and you mix it in with either water or breast milk or formula. And the first time you give it to baby, I wish I could see you guys in person right now, because the first time you give it to baby, uh, their little tongue thrusts out. So they're used to drinking from a bottle or drinking from the mother's breast. And the way they do that motion with their mouth, if you've ever seen it with a baby, or even with a pacifier, if you ever take a pacifier out of a baby's mouth, they're sucking. It's the sucking motion. So the tongue is thrusting forward, and they don't know any better. So the first time you give them that rice cereal, it just goes into their mouth, and it usually comes right back out because they're not used to eating. So it takes a few days for them to get used to that, and that's totally normal. It's kind of funny. It gets very messy. But once they get the hang of it and they start realizing, oh, I'm supposed to swallow this and not push it out of my mouth, now they're understanding how to eat. This is such an important milestone. And again, this happens around 6 months of age. Sometimes the doctor will say, "Oh, the baby's 4 months and we're not gaining weight as well as I want to see them gain weight." So you can start supplementing with rice cereal, because that will start adding in a little bit more calories for them. But typically, if you can get to age 6 months and wait, that's even better. So because they're not quite, developmentally ready for that until age 6 months. So it says 4 to 6, but I'm going to say if they can wait till 6 months, that's a little bit better. So that's when they're ready for that. Also around this time, there's other developmental milestones happening. They're usually able to sit up on their own at 6 months of age. You might have to prop them up a little bit with maybe like a pillow behind them or a blanket or something, but they should be able to sit in a high chair at age 6 months. So that's a really important thing to be able to do. They need to have the neck muscles strong enough to do that, the back muscles strong enough to do that. One of the things that you will be required to do from your pediatrician when you have a baby is you're required to give them enough tummy time during the day. And that literally is where you put your baby on your tummy and they practice looking up, and they're trying to go more towards that crawling motion. And that's really important to be able to do that, because it's strengthening their back muscles, their neck muscles, and they're able to physically move in that direction. So the goal for that for crawling, is to try to get them to crawl. And that can look like all kinds of things. My first son, never actually did a normal crawl. We even laugh about, we have videos of it, and he always did an army crawl. So he was literally like flat on his tummy and would just like scoot himself along, from point A to point B. And the doctor said that as long as they're getting from one point to the other, that's fine. Some babies actually completely skip the crawling stage and they go right towards walking. But as long as they're rolling, they're doing some sort of movement to get from, again, point A to point B, that's really important to look for. So, and that also goes into play with feeding. So that's why I'm bringing that up. It's important that the crawling actually has a connection to being able to sit up and feed and be able to eat solid food. What happens usually during, I would say, oh gosh, it doesn't say on here, but towards age 7 months or so, that's the time when baby can start to eat a lot more different types of foods. Now, there's a whole regimen on how you want to do this. When you're introducing new foods, it says here you want to wait 7 days before introducing a new food. You can even do it before that. The book says 7 days. You could do maybe like 3 or 4 days in between. So the reason for doing that is you want to make sure that the baby does not have any food allergies. That's one thing that we're seeing now, and I think I have a slide on this coming up, is that there is a total increase in food allergies amongst children nowadays. And the scary fact of the matter is we really don't know why. There's not rhyme or reason to that. There's a lot of theories out there right now of why that's happening. One of them being, how our food is so different now than it was even 20 years ago with genetic modification. And also, just the soil is different, lots of cross contamination, that type of thing. So that could be one reason why, but we haven't, in terms of science, we haven't really pinpointed one thing of why that is happening. So everyone has their own thoughts on that. Maybe something to research would be something to look into. But so waiting 3 or 4 days, I would say, between introducing a new food, and usually after you do the rice cereal, and it's always iron fortified, by the way, because iron is something that's really important that the baby needs to be getting during that first year of life. Breast milk does supply a little bit, but it's really important to supplement with that iron fortified cereal. In fact, they specifically will do a little blood test for the baby to make sure that the baby's getting enough iron. Because as you guys know, if you remember, iron is really important, and we talk, it's connected to anemia, which means that your body is not getting enough oxygen. So if your body is not getting enough oxygen, and think about that during these essential growing years and how that can impact the baby's brain health and brain growth. So it's really important that the baby's getting enough iron during that first year of life. Usually, it says strained foods and meats. Usually, vegetables are given first. So, like sweet potatoes, peas, which smell absolutely disgusting, by the way. But when you're giving it to a baby, they don't really know the difference. This is their first food that they're getting. So that's usually a good food to give them first. And then it's funny because after you start giving them fruits and they have that sweetness, or even sweet potatoes, then they start realizing like, ooh, sugar tastes good. And then you try to give them the peas again and they're like, oh, this is disgusting. So it's kind of funny to see that in a baby. And you want to be sure, speaking of sugar, you want to be sure that you're not, overdoing it with too many sweet foods, obviously, because that's something you don't want to get them hooked on the sugar early on in life, because that is very addicting. Obviously, offering breast milk formula or water during the day in a sippy cup, and that's usually more towards age 1 when they're able to drink out of a cup or even suck out of a straw. That, takes some skills to master that. That takes a little while. Usually babies being fed through the breast or through a bottle only until age 1. And then after that is when you want to start trying to introduce the cup. When you start reading parenting books, you feel stressed out because they tell you, oh, by age 1, they should be drinking out of a cup and they should be doing this and that. And you feel pressure to be able to do all these things. After having kids, my advice to all of you, note this down because you're going to need this in your real life later on, is that don't stress out about it, because most kids will get the hang of all these little milestones along the way on their own. Don't stress. Introduce, keep introducing. They'll get it after a while. So it's okay. I've had so many friends that, think my kid is never going to live without a pacifier. They're going to be 12 years old and in diapers still. I think as a parent, when you have babies, that's how you feel in the moment. But trust me when I tell you that all that stuff works itself out and it's all okay. The one thing I do want you to know is there's no cow's milk before age 1. So that's really important. Breast milk only or formula only up until age 1. After that, you can switch over to cow's milk. The reason being is that cow's milk is very high in protein and it's too much for baby's kidneys. At age 1, baby's system has developed enough to be able to handle that protein. So that's okay. Now, when you switch over, because this is not on the slide, I want you to write this down. When you switch over, it's important that you're switching over and using whole milk products only. That amount of fat is so incredibly important. Now, I know there's a lot of individuals, students, people in the world nowadays that are anti-dairy. And that's something to keep in mind, because if you're not doing cow's milk, you want to make sure that the baby is getting enough nutrition and enough fat during that first year of life. So you need to make sure that you're including that in other places. So healthy fats is so incredibly important. Whether you're making like maybe like an almond milk smoothie and you're adding in some like avocado oil or some coconut oil or something to increase that fat is incredibly important during those first years of life. So something to think about. Also, please make sure you guys jot this down. This is really important to know. There is something called baby bottle tooth decay. And this is what it looks like right here, this picture right here. In fact, I don't know if I even have that on this slide. No, I don't. So make sure you guys jot that down, these words down. Baby bottle tooth decay. It's an actual term that is used for babies that have teeth that look similar to this. And the way it happens is, make sure you guys write this down, really important, is that oftentimes when we put babies to sleep, they soothe themselves through the sucking motion. It's very calming for them. So whether that be through a pacifier or through a bottle, or even sometimes like with mom breastfeeding, that's how they fall asleep. It's a very calming feeling for them. Now, what can happen is that if you continue to feed while they're sleeping for a long period of time, so let's say you put baby to sleep with a bottle of, let's say cow's milk, right? They're after the age of 1, they're still on a bottle, and you put them to sleep with a bottle in their mouth, cow's milk. That sugar, the lactose that's in that milk, is going to start pooling around their teeth. Because when you hold a bottle upside down, if you've ever done that before, it slowly drips out. It's not like a cup where it just flows out. It slowly drips out. And so the baby has to suck on that nipple to go ahead and get the milk out. And while it's sleeping, the baby is sleeping and using the bottle, the milk is just pooling around their teeth, and it can cause this tooth decay. This, surprisingly, is a huge problem in the United States. It's actually on our list of healthy objectives for year 2020 currently, to be able to try to educate individuals on how to stop this from happening. So you may have even seen babies with this before. It's not that uncommon. And it's obviously an issue because you're killing the tooth, and you're also killing not only the tooth but the root underneath. So oftentimes parents will think, oh, it's not a big deal. These are baby teeth. They'll fall out anyway. Well, it can be a big deal because you're damaging the root underneath, which can then damage the permanent tooth that's under there. So it's really important to not do that. If you're going to put the baby to sleep, use a pacifier if they need that, or use water in the bottle if they need that sucking motion, so you're not having the sugar around the teeth. And guys, I've seen all kinds of things in bottles before. I've seen Pepsi. We were at Disneyland one time, and the people in front of us had a baby in a stroller, and they were taking their Coke or Pepsi from their huge bottle that they had, pouring it into the bottle, screwing the top on, and giving it to the baby. And I have seen it. And so people are just so unaware of the damage that can happen when you introduce that much sugar, especially with a soda, that early in life, and how addicting that is. I'm going to post for you guys a commercial that is so incredibly important to watch. It's my favorite commercial of all times for you guys to see, just so you can understand what can happen when you start introducing sugary foods early on in life, okay, and how addicting it can be throughout your entire life. So no pressure again, but really important. Okay, what to feed an infant. These are if you look at it, it's all stuff that you guys know. So it's all the regular dietary guidelines, making sure you're including fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber. It says don't overdo fiber because babies, their digestive system is delicate. We'll just say that. And so if you're getting too much fiber in there, they can just have explosions a lot. So we've dealt with that. I think every parent has dealt with that, but you just want to make sure to not overdo it with that. What not to feed an infant. There's a long list. I'll let you guys take a look at this. I do want to point out, and let's see, is it on here? No. The number one, I want you guys to jot this down. This is good information for your personal life. The number one cause of choking, and this is not only for kids, mostly for kids, but it can be also for adults too, are hot dogs. hot dogs are the #1 food in America that people choke on. If you think about it, think about the shape of a hot dog, okay? If you know, a lot of people, when they give hot dogs to kids, they cut it up and they coin it. So there's these little perfect circles that oftentimes kids do not chew very well when they start, when they're early in life and their ages 1 and 2, they're not chewing very well. They don't chew properly yet. And so when they're eating a hot dog that's a coin size object, that will get lodged directly in their esophagus and down their throat. So, and it's scary, and because when you're choking, there's no air going in or out, and you don't know oftentimes if somebody's choking if you can't hear them. So there's been lots of stories of mom cutting up the hot dogs, giving it to the toddler in the high chair. She walks away for a few minutes to go do something, comes back, and the baby's passed out because the baby has choked on the hot dog. There's no noise involved. So it's very scary. So if you are going to give a hot dog to a little kid, please make sure you do not cut it into coins. You can cut the coins and then you cut it down the middle to make like a half moon type shape. That's better than the coin. Even better if you can even put it into a quarter shape. Because it's the #1 cause of choking. There's all other foods that you can, think of too, like grapes. You want to make sure to cut into little chunks. I'm trying to think. Peanuts, popcorn is hard to sometimes, in terms of choking. So obviously these other things, honey. You have to be careful with honey. I know it sounds kind of crazy. Honey in particular, up until the age of 1, is considered to be risky because it naturally contains a small amount of botulism. And botulism, as you guys know from when we talked about food safety chapter, you probably noticed, botulism is that one foodborne illness that if you have like a canned food and it's bulging, that's not a good sign. That's a telltale sign of botulism. So now it happens naturally in honey, and it's honey that's raw. So it's honey that has not been pasteurized. Still, what they do for safety precautions, if you look at a bottle of honey, it will have a little warning sign on there that says do not feed to infants under the age of 1. That's why. So if in case you were wondering, that's what that means. Let's see, anything else I want to bring up that I didn't? Nope, I think that's it. Okay, so this is just talking about how rapid kids are growing. Obviously, there's a lot of inches being grown per year. These are the growing years. There's a lot of pounds per, growing that they're gaining per year. That's all normal. And what happens with these growth rates, as you guys can imagine, is that, let me go back, is that, I thought I maybe had a slide on it, but I don't, is that if you look at a chart of growth rates, what happens is the child will usually get very hungry before a growth spurt. And during that growth spurt, oh, I do have a slide. It's in my adolescent section. Okay, we'll get to that. During the growth spurt is when the child will gain a bunch of height, and the weight actually might stay they don't really gain too much weight. It's kind of like if you look at a picture of this, if you're looking at like a cartoon picture of this, I used to have a cartoon, it's the weight kind of like disperses where the child will maybe look a little whiter, and then during the growth spurt, the child grows up, and that width actually turns into length, if that makes sense. So that's kind of how a growth spurt happens. Now, usually throughout childhood and adolescent years, there's multiple little growth spurts that happen, right? That's normal. And then during adolescent years, which we'll get to, there's one main growth spurt. And sometimes people have up to 2 or 3 main growth spurts, but everybody will have one major one. So we'll get to that. That's what I was thinking of in my mind. Okay, obviously making sure you're choosing nutrient-dense food, really, really important. You guys are familiar with My Plate. You did an assignment on My Plate. And there's a section on there for kids. So, and there's all kinds of information now on their internet in terms of nutrition for children. Okay, picky eating. It's a major common. Got this down for kids. This is something that is very, very common. It's very frustrating for parents and caregivers with kids that are very, very picky. And usually for most children, they grow out of this. Now, there are some individuals that have a hard time growing out of this. You may even now, or you may even know somebody now as an adult that is still considered to be a picky eater. So that's not as common, but it does happen. And actually, if you're interested in looking more into it, doctors are now classifying that, like if you're a picky eater as an adult, and I'm talking about you're only eating like 3 different foods. It's actually more of an eating disorder. So there's other things going on behind that. If you were to look, more detailed into it and to start analyzing it. But anyway, for most kids, picky eating is a common thing. Really important that it's to understand that they're more interested in playing, and that's normal, than in eating. It's really important though as parents and caretakers to keep offering. Don't give up. That's so important to understand. Do not give up. Sometimes the book says may take up to 10 exposures or more until the food is considered acceptable to them. When you give a new food to a child in a high chair, oftentimes they look at it, they touch it, they play with it, they may throw it. It gets very messy. That's okay. That's okay. They're exploring. It's foreign to them. If you were to look back in like the caveman days, right? Prehistoric times, what happened back then, it's all about being careful with your foods and making sure that the food doesn't have poison in it. So that's kind of ingrained in, humans over the years. And a lot of people think that maybe that's why kids still do that to this day, is that it's kind of a protective mechanism. So if you're introduced it a few times, they see that, parents are eating the same food, and that's okay. And so they'll understand, oh, this is a safe food. It's okay to have. They try it. And then over time, after maybe like 5 exposures, 10 exposures, sometimes it may even take up to 15 exposures for a child to try something new. So don't give up. One thing that I can say as a parent, and it does show in research also, the more fun you make food, the more easy it is for them to try it. So you can have foods served on like in a bento box. You can put them in an ice cube tray and cut it up. For some reason, it's fun to eat out of those little boxes. I used to have a friend that, no joke, she would put rainbow sprinkles on everything for her child just to get her to eat. And, we go, and again, these phases don't last forever. They're very short-term things. Just know that I know it's frustrating at the time, but children do grow out of these phases. And the one thing, if I can tell you guys one thing to start doing with kids, because I think this is a dying thing, is that if you can start getting them back into the kitchen, get them cooking with you, get them trying new things, get them prepping food with you, they are absolutely 100% more likely to try new foods if they do that in the kitchen with the caregiver. So really, it's so important. The other thing I want to just point out here is that dinner table should not be a battleground for control. And what I mean by that is, let me give an example. Johnny can't eat dessert until he finishes his entire plate. You will sit there for hours if you need to until you eat your entire plate, and then you can have dessert. So that's an example of a battleground for control, because there are kids that will sit there for hours and not touch their food. So to me, what's happening there is now you're creating a negative emotion with food, and that can actually affect you later on in life. So it's really important to have a healthy relationship with food early on in life, because you will take that with you. And some of you may be even listening to this lecture right now thinking, yes, I totally get that. You will take that with you into your adulthood. Food is very emotional. We have very strong emotional connections with food. So you don't want to make it a battleground for control. You don't want to force anything. You may make deals with kids. Like if they're just not eating anything, you may make, hey, have one bite, just try it. And if you don't like it, that's okay. So we've done that with our kids, over the years. Now I have to say, I think from years of just trying new foods, getting them involved in, basically doing everything that you're supposed to do, they will eat pretty much anything. And they're great eaters. They love food. We call them little foodies. And so it's been food for them is an enjoyable experience. So it's really, really important that you start that on early on in life. Really great. Making sure that snacking is always healthy. You're having healthy snacks always out. One study that I loved reading, this was years ago, and I do it now today. I read this study when my kids were little, and I remember thinking, what a great idea. A couple different things is that they've done this with children. They've done studies where you put a bowl of fruit out on the counter, and consumption of fruit drastically increases in the household. Because what happens is, like when you're walking by, you see, oh, there's an apple, I think I'll grab that. And that's absolutely true. Also, the other thing too, for kids, if you have like, you may have seen this before on cutie oranges, they put little fun little stickers on there. The reason why they do that is they've found that that makes it more enjoyable to eat for kids. When there's a fun little sticker on your fruit, it's fun. So I mean, just little fun, anything to make it fun. Again, is the key for kids. Um, there's a certain things that I do want you to jot down here, that I want you to know. Lead poisoning. I know it sounds kind of crazy. It's an actual problem that happens today in the United States for kids. This is a major problem because if children are being exposed to lead early on in their life, it can affect how their brain develops, their growth rate, intellectual problems, behavior problems later on in life and in school, at home, the whole thing. So lead, why this is being brought up here is lead has been found in our food, which is scary. So you may have remembered years ago, there was a whole thing, it was a massive recall on Mexican candy because there was a large amount of lead that was found in that candy, and kids were eating it. It was very popular, and it was a huge problem. So they recalled all that candy, but it still sometimes happens in food, in our food supply. And usually it can happen in these areas here: contaminated drinking water. So, you know, you want to make sure that you're getting your water from a clean source, obviously. I know we talked about water in this class, but I can tell you personally, like what we do at home, we have a filter on our tap here at home. So I do not use water bottles. I just use refillable stainless steel bottles, like hydro flasks, things like that, and just refill those from our filtered water at home. But there's other things you can do. I know you guys have mentioned that you have like those little carbon filters, that like Brita filters. Those are great. So you want to make sure that you're, you know, getting, you know, water from like a trusted source type thing. Now, tap water, I know you guys can do your own research. Tap water is great. It is, you know, filtered through the system and all that. You guys may be familiar with the whole saga that happened in Flint, Michigan a few years back. I think to this day, they're still dealing with issues from that. So that it does happen. Even though we have this highly regulated water process here in the United States, there are things that can still seep in. So just, you know, be careful with that. I urge you guys to do your own personal research on that and take your own precautions for yourself. Dietary supplements sometimes. Remember, dietary supplements are not regulated here in the United States by the FDA. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. Making sure you're getting that from a trusted company, and making sure that the product is of good quality, that type of thing. So again, doing your own research is the best thing you can do for that. Okay. Autism and nutrition. There has been some talk about, you know, does food exacerbate it? Does it make it worse? Does it make it better? You know, all that. So here's the deal, is that right now there's no specific scientific evidence that says this type of food causes this. And there is absolutely no link between eating, if you're eating a high fast food diet, that causes autism. No, that is not the situation at all. It actually is. This slide is talking more about if you have autism, are there certain foods that maybe can make it worse, or maybe foods that can make it better? And there are certain things that we've found through some more recent studies. If you look at this bottom part here, that kids, and it's not all children that have autism, but, and as you may be aware, autism is a spectrum disorder. So you could have two very similar children that, you know, have autism that have completely different autistic disorders. So there's certain diets that may work best for one and not for the other. So that's why there's no one size fits all with this. But I'm going to say this, is that they have done studies that they found with certain individuals with autism have benefited from a gluten-free, casein-free diet, which is dairy, because they found that those particular foods have caused a lot of inflammation, particularly in the brain and in the gut. And your gut and your brain health are actually very closely connected, as you guys have known from this class. So remember when we talked about probiotics and how important that is for immune system health and all that. So it's really important, if you know somebody with autism, to get the help from a registered dietitian, because they're going to put you on a very specific type of diet specifically for that individual. It's a very individualistic type of diet. Okay. Let's talk about overweight and obesity for kids. Now, this is a very important statistic that you absolutely have to jot down. Since 1970s, overweight and obesity has more than tripled in the United States. That's a crazy statistic if you think about it. Overweight and obesity has more than tripled in the United States for children. So that's scary because in the 70s, it was rare to see a child that was overweight. Nowadays, it is common. And it's scary because if you think about, go back to our, your obesity project that you guys are doing, that are you're currently doing this semester or have done, um, you know that there's a long list of diseases that comes along with being overweight. And the scary thing is that children are now being, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, as we talked about, heart disease. That's scary. Children should not be getting these diseases. So here's this crazy thing too, is that about 40% of obese children and about 80% of obese adolescents become obese adults. So what this is telling us is that if you start off as an obese child or as an obese teenager, you're going to carry that with you into your adulthood. And why is that a problem? It's a problem because of all those terrible diseases that come along with it. And when you've created those habits, it's hard to break out of that cycle. So that's why I'm talking. It's so important to start early on in life with making those healthy food choices. Okay. Physical activity, 60 minutes per day. It's a little bit more for kids than it is for adults. They should be getting double the amount of physical activity. Screen time, obviously, no more than 2 hours per day is what the recommendation is. Because the more that you watch TV or the more that you're on a screen, obviously, the less likely you are to be active. So that's the connection there. Okay, these two commercials I'm going to post so you guys can look at that either before or afterwards. Really important that you watch these. I think they're both really important commercials to watch. We talked about how we're seeing these terrible diseases in kids now, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol in kids now. I mean, these are things, again, we did not see at all, even 20 years ago. So it's scary that these things are happening, type 2 diabetes in youth. We've talked about in class how important it is to have a healthy breakfast, right? So it's really important for kids, obviously, to start their day with breakfast. They've connected it with reducing obesity risk for children. They've also connected it with having higher test scores in school. They've connected it with lower behavioral problems in school, in the classroom, and at home. Breakfast can really make a huge difference with setting the tone for the day for children and how they're going to act and behave. So important that kids are getting that healthy breakfast. Again, and you guys know we've talked about making sure it's balanced with the healthy carbs and the healthy protein and the healthy fat. And just like with adults, you want to make sure you're choosing healthy fats and not the unhealthy fats. You want to make sure that I think for this slide is specifically talking about like soft drinks and fruit drinks, sports drinks for kids, because those juices, it says, 100% juices, that sounds healthy. But as we know, juice is basically equates to sugar. So if kids like juice, you can water it down. That's actually what I've done for my kids over the years. When they were little, if they wanted to have a little treat, I would do, 3/4 water and 1/4 juice. And that was kind of like their little treat, And so, and now even today, they're 10 and 12. They really don't like a lot of sweet stuff. And I have to say personally, that probably has a lot to do with them not having a ton of sugar, in those earlier years, because as we know, sugar is very, very addictive. Not to say that they don't like, they're normal children, and they do love their sugar, but it's funny because I know, especially my 12-year-old now, I've noticed that he's like, oh, there's too much sugar in there. Like he's now making that conscious effort of not choosing certain things. So because I think it just doesn't sit well, it doesn't feel good to have that. There's some promotion of nutrition in schools, not enough. If, I wish you guys were in person right now, because I would say, do you guys think that nutrition should be taught in schools, and why? It's a question to think about. So maybe ask yourself that question right now and think about the answer. And a lot of you have probably never been exposed to nutrition until college. And if you were exposed to nutrition, it was probably in high school for a little bit in your health class. And even with that, it's a very small amount of information. So it's something that I truly am passionate about. Obviously, I'm teaching it, but I feel like it's so incredibly important to teach kids nutrition. The earlier, the better, because when you start it off earlier in life, it can only help you for the remainder of your entire life in so many different ways. And those commercials, again, that commercial will really show that one commercial. Okay, I do want you guys to know this. Important, star it, highlight it, circle it, whatever. Teenage years. Okay, so now we're going through the childhood years. Now we're in the teenage years. Obviously, lots of growth spurts are happening. The major growth spurt for boys happens a little later on, 12 to 15 years is typically when this happens. Major growth spurt for girls usually happens between the ages of 10 and 13. So middle school is that awkward time, if you guys remember back, where usually the girls are towering over the boys, and it's just that weird time anyway, I think, for everybody. And there's puberty that's happening and hormones and all that kind of crazy stuff. I'm in the midst of it right now, my older son. But yeah, there's the rapid growth spurt that happens during that time. Height. Okay, make sure you guys are jotting this down. Girls are getting 10 inches during that growth spurt. Boys, 12 inches, a whole foot. So you can imagine how hungry they are up to this point, right? And even during that point, there's a huge increase in appetite, especially before the major growth spurt. After the growth spurt is when appetite subsides a lot of times. So it's just a weird time anyway. There's a lot of peer pressure. Eating choices oftentimes are hard because they care about, being with their friends and being included and making, they're all going to eat pizza together and drink soda, and so you can see how that kind of snowballs into the unhealthy eating habits. Really, really important that you know this as well. Calcium and vitamin D. If you guys remember back when we talked about calcium, the major thing during the teenage years is the bone growth. And so it's really incredibly important that kids are getting the recommended amount of calcium and vitamin D during this time, because you can't make it up later, okay? One of the things, let me go back here, that I want you to know is that it's not on this slide, but teens during this year, during the bone building years, is that they're gaining about 45% in their bone tissue. 45%. I do want you to know that. So because of, that's not on here. It must be on another slide. That 45% of the bone tissue, I want you to know, is what they're gaining during this this growth spurt. Okay. And most kids are not getting enough, as you can see. 10% of girls, 25% of boys are meeting the recommendations for calcium intake. Okay. Alcohol abuse, I'm not going to go into it. You don't need to know that for final exam purposes. This is just talking about allergies with kids. And the one thing I do want you to know is this word down here, anaphylaxis. This is basically when you have a major food allergy response to the point that your throat is closing up. And this is a big deal. Obviously, you have to have something called an epinephrine pen to take with you, or an EpiPen. So make sure you jot that down, an EpiPen, EPI, or epinephrine. And epinephrine is basically a type of adrenaline. It's a synthetic type of adrenaline to help combat that. So let's see, food allergies are on the rise, like I mentioned. We're not exactly sure why. It's a kind of a big mystery. For testing food allergies, you've got to do a skin prick test. Sometimes they'll do blood tests. It's not 100% though. That's the thing. The only way to know is this one, this bullet point right here. Eliminate all foods for 1 to 2 weeks to see if the symptoms subside. So if you're getting an allergic reaction, you don't know why, take out some suspecting foods from your diet. And you can do this as an adult as well. And then you need to slowly incorporate to see if you have reaction. These are the 8 leading causes for food allergies that I want you to know. This was also in another chapter, so this is a little bit of repeat, but milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, wheat, and soy. So make sure you guys know that, okay? And then also, just as an FYI, and I think we went through this also in another chapter, but peanuts and tree nuts are in 2 different categories because of They're two different things. So peanuts are actually legumes. They grow under the ground. Tree nuts grow on trees. Fish and shellfish, two different things. Fish, think of like an actual fish, like salmon, trout, tuna, that type of thing. Shellfish, that's different. That's like shrimp, lobster, okay? Scallops, shellfish, two different things. So you can be allergic to one and not the other. I know it sounds kind of weird, but they're actually two different categories. Okay. Breastfeeding your baby actually helps to prevent food allergies, which is kind of cool, which we talked about, I think, in the last chapter. Okay, let me show you the very last thing that I want you to know from chapter 16. Okay, so chapter 16, nutrition during adulthood. Okay, so this chapter, like I mentioned, is kind of like a recap of everything that we've talked about to date. And the thing that I want you to understand is that the 85 plus population is the fastest growing population in the United States. Isn't that crazy? So I want the assignment that you have for this week actually goes into this. And I want you to realize how that's going to impact everybody in the United States. Okay, so think about that. And the reason that how it does impact is this little area right here. People over the age of 65 account for 13% of the population, account for 25% of all prescription medications, account for 40% of all hospitalizations, 50% of federal health budget. That means that we are paying for this group of people, all of the United States. So 80% or more have chronic conditions. Many can be prevented or damaged. The one thing I do want you to know from this chapter, and let me move ahead, is this: life expectancy. This is the current life expectancy of the United States. In North America, actually, 76 years for men is the average age in which men live, 81 years for women. But here's the thing: only 64 of these are considered to be healthy years, which means these are the years where they feel pretty okay. After that, age 65 and above, things start going downhill. And we're talking on medications, all kinds of complications, surgeries, ailments, not feeling good all the time. So it's really, really, really important that nutrition is number one, early on in life, all the way through childhood, adolescent, and into those later years, because it is going to build a healthy foundation for the rest of your life. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I've been talking a lot today, and you guys hopefully took good notes. Keep those notes, take those with you, use them for the assignment and for the final exam. If you guys have any questions, as always, please let me know, and have a great week.